Hey everybody. So at this point, we've covered open source and we've covered HTML and CSS. We've covered open source both from a technical perspective in terms of the tools that we're going to be using this quarter, Git and GitHub. We've also talked a little bit about, both in the notes and the videos, some of the politics associated with open source as a movement, the different ideas and philosophies that bring people to that way of working. We've also looked at open source from the perspective of new media theory, specifically Lev Manovich's book, Language of New Media, and this idea of versioning as a kind of fundamental principle of digital objects. And then we also covered HTML and CSS. Technically, like how to write HTML and CSS. It was sort of that crash course, that review of a lot of the stuff that I covered in the intro course, which approaches those two languages from a NetArt perspective. And we also talked about some of the sort of cultural activity around those languages on the internet, specifically looking at the NetArt movement, but also other interesting cultural movements like hypermedia, like some of the experimental real-time work from the 70s in Chicago.
And with that, you
a lot of the hypermedia ideas came from. Also looked a little bit at CSS art in some of those tutorials and other kind of creative ends that people apply those languages to. So we've got the sort of foundation laid. We've got HTML and CSS, Git, GitHub, and now we can really dive into the meat, the kind of focus of this intermediate internet art course, which is programming, specifically learning the sort of de facto programming language of the web, which is JavaScript, and using that language and using programming towards creative ends, towards aesthetic, experimental, expressive, conceptual, philosophical, political ends, rather than maybe for utilitarian ends, right? We tend to think of software as a tool, as utility. We use programming languages to build softwares that people can use as tools, but we're going to be approaching programming and building software in this class from the perspective of art towards all those other ends that software can take us. And so we're going to be covering a lot of ideas associated with thinking about software that way today, or in this set of videos. There's one kind of key core idea at the center of our first experiments in programming, which is chance, or what we call in the art world chance, and what we typically refer to in the computer science world as randomness. I mean, they mean the same thing, but two different words that are used in those two different contexts, chance and randomness. And in particular, what it means to embrace chance and randomness in your creative process. Randomness or chance can seem like a very simple, or is a very kind of simple concept, but it's rich with creative potential. Randomness can be used to discover things in creative processes that we otherwise wouldn't have. One of my favorite examples there is the composer John Cage. I know I've talked about John Cage in last quarter, but I can't remember if we've brought him up yet in this quarter. So if not, there's one of my favorite musical compositions of all time is this one, 433 by John Cage. This is the sheet music for 433. 433 is 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. So this is it. This is the entire score. It's just 3 movements of silence. Silence was another big theme in John Cage's work. It's the title of the book that contains his collected essays and writings, Silence. But the vast majority of the ideas in here are all about embracing chance and randomness in the creative process. The thing about 433 is that while it is 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, part of the point of this piece is that there is no such thing as silence. Every time the piece is performed and the performer sits in front of their piano quietly for 4 minutes 33 seconds, you end up noticing all of the other noises and background sounds of the environment that you're in, and that becomes, in a sense, the piece. And so every time the piece is performed, it's different. It's up to chance and the sounds of that environment. And John Cage really, like I said, really embraced this idea of chance and randomness. Sometimes, typically a musician, a composer might sit down and take out some sheet, like to write sheet music and write the notes that they want a musician to perform. John Cage would oftentimes flip a coin and pick the notes based on coin flips, which means the melodies that he'd write out, rather than being the product of his sort of sensibilities and sort of conventions and sort of styles and stuff, it would be completely up to chance. And sometimes that might result in something that doesn't sound very interesting, but sometimes it could result in something super interesting. And so chance kind of opens the door to be surprised, for you to be surprised by your own compositions and work. Chance has been embraced by so many artists over the course of modern art, which is to say all the various interesting movements in art that have occurred over the last like 150 years. Another group of art, like the Surrealists embrace chance, Dada artists embrace chance. My favorite Dada artist, one of my favorite artists of all time, is Marcel Duchamp. This is a framed photo of Marcel Duchamp that I keep in my bathroom, that I've kept in every bathroom of every apartment I've ever lived in since I was 18. Not exactly sure why, but it feels like a Marcel Duchamp sort of thing to do, if you know what I mean. Marcel Duchamp was also really big into this, embracing chance. I mean, he had pieces that were literally just the results of chance operations, like John Cage, but for the Dada artists, it was also a way to get around like writer's block. Like when you're, and any artist is familiar with this in any medium, sometimes you just don't have those creative juices flowing and you're kind of stuck. And that can be extra shitty when you've got like a deadline for a project or something and you feel that pressure, but you can't quite come up with stuff. Chance is a way to get through that writer's block. The Dada artists would oftentimes do this thing where they would cut up words from magazines, put them in a bag, like a little pouch, and then write poems by taking out words randomly and stringing them together. And those poems, I mean, if it came out interesting, that could straight up be the work and you release that as a new poem, but it's also just could be a part of your process, a way to kind of get over that writer's block. There might be interesting fragments or pieces in those randomly generated poems that could be kind of like the starting point, the seed of a new poem, of a new idea. That process, by the way, for kind of cutting up words and stringing them together was probably made most famous by the writer William Burroughs, and the technique was called like the cut-up technique. So chance is also a way of kind of getting around being stuck. Chance is also a big part of kind of coming up with interesting new aesthetics, like the like abstract expressionism. There was a lot of artists were just dipping, like painters were dipping their brushes in cans of paint and just whipping it at the canvas and just seeing where the paint fell. And there's a kind of collaboration with chance there, right? Because the artist is making certain choices about which colors of paint to use, the size of the canvas, how hard to kind of swing at it. But so many of the details for what that composition would end up being was left up to chance. I mean, some artists might disagree with my particular characterization of those abstract expressionists. I read an interview once with Jackson Pollock, who claimed that he could light a candle at the end of the room, dip his brush in a paint bucket, and whip it at the candle and sort of take the flame out with his paint. I'm going to call bullshit on that. I'm going to say that he's wrong and I'm right, and that really he didn't have control over where that paint landed, and it was a collaboration with randomness and chance that led to these new aesthetics. And it's not, I mean, I'm talking about old artistic movements here, but we see chance embraced in digital art and in new technology, in art that's made with new technologies all over the place. Glitch art is another sort of subgenre of internet art and new media art that I referenced in a previous video, and that's so much about embracing chance. What happens when you corrupt a file and open it up in another program? Let's see. And sometimes that can be pretty interesting. Other more contemporary mediums like video games, in their book, Rules of Play, Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman write about how chance and uncertainty is key to creating meaningful play. Chance is huge in video games and in games in general, even before video games really. So allowing for surprises, discovering new aesthetics, getting over your own writer's block, creating these kinds of meaningful plays. This is the kind of richness that comes out of embracing chance and randomness in your creative process. So in these videos that in this playlist that'll follow this intro, we're going to be learning to program, specifically learning to program in the language of JavaScript. But what we're going to be doing is recreating a particular program that's very simple, but has all the basics of programming. So this is going to allow us to kind of cover all of the basics, and has at its center this idea of randomness. which is going to open up. I mean, there's some interesting questions when we bring chance and randomness into the world of digital art, into the world of programming and computers, because computers are deterministic machines. Their outputs is essentially predetermined based on the input. So how is it that we can have randomness in a computer? And why would we want to have randomness in a computer? There are a lot of answers to both of those questions. And those are going to be covered in an essay that I want you to read on randomness. So this essay comes from this book. It's called Temperament for short, but you can see there the full title of the book. That is the name of the book, but it is also a program for the Commodore 64. This is a Commodore 64. It's an early home computer. This is the keyboard, but it's also like the computer. You plug this into like a TV, and then you start programming. And there was a program written for that computer in a language called BASIC that looks like this. This is the whole program, and it results in a pattern that looks like this. So we're going to be recreating this program, but we're going to be doing it in JavaScript. This book, so just a little bit of background here. So this comes from that software studies camp. I've been throwing around a few terms here. I think it's worth diving into this a little bit. So this is an internet art class. We're making internet art. Internet art is one category that we can place the work that we're doing. We can contextualize the work that we're doing this quarter within. But like I mentioned in another one of the videos, these categories, these aren't walls for us to kind of be stuck within. These are lenses for us to kind of look at our work through and think about our work and other work that we're going to look at. Internet art is a common kind of category here, but so's new media art. So I've used this term already a few times. New media art and internet art, there's a big overlap here. Internet art typically refers to work that has the internet at the center somehow, either because it's work that is made for the internet that can only really exist online, or it could be work that is about the internet. So like if I wrote a song about the internet, like the song Embedded by net artist Young Jake.
I'm trying to get embedded, I'm trying to get laid out, I'm trying to get embedded, I'm trying to get played out, I'm trying to get embedded, I'm trying to get laid out.
That's a song, but it's also internet art because it's about the internet. So a lot of the work that we're going to be doing, we can think of it and analyze it and discuss it as internet art, but we could also think about it and discuss it as new media art. In fact, the piece on the cover of this book is by a net artist named Mark Napier, and what it's this piece called Shredder, and it actually takes the HTML code of a website, and instead of rendering it the way that the browser is meant to render it, it garbles it all up and creates these sort of like almost abstract expressionist compositions from the code of the HTML page. So you give it a website and it spits out this kind of stuff. So this is net art, but it's on the cover of a book called New Media Art. New media art is just another category, another lens through which we can look and understand the work that we're making in this course through. I've already referenced this when I talked about Lev Manovich and his principles of new media, right? That, again, this word new media, this typically refers to work that is usually but not always screen-based work, but also very much digital age screen-based work. So I mean, you can kind of think of these are artists. This is a way of thinking about contemporary internet art from a kind of screen-based lineage, like from film to video to new media art, right? Versus internet art might have other kinds of lineages, or might benefit from kind of characterizing that stuff differently. And then another sort of useful lens through which to look at the work that we're going to be doing this quarter is the software studies lens, which I talked about or kind of referenced in a previous video, and I said that we'd be coming back to it, and we will a couple times this quarter. This is one of those moments. So software studies is essentially, these are academics working at universities all over the globe that analyze and study software, but less from the traditional maybe computer science perspective, and more from a kind of humanities perspective. I'll read the intro to this book, or the intro to software studies from this book. Actually, I won't read the whole intro. I'm just going to read the very beginning. The whole book is available online, though, as a PDF under Creative Commons, so you have access to it right now. You could read along this intro with me. But it starts, software is deeply woven into contemporary life, economically, culturally, creatively, politically, in manners both obvious and nearly invisible. Yet, while much is written about how software is used and the activities that it supports and shapes, thinking about software itself has remained largely technical for much of its history. Increasingly, however, artists, scientists, engineers, hackers, designers, and scholars in the humanities and social sciences are finding that for the questions they face and the things they need to build, an expanded understanding of software is necessary. It is that expanded understanding of software that this group of academics working under this umbrella of software studies are kind of setting out to achieve. And this particular book, which is the focus of our experiment today, is an entire book just focused on analyzing this one line of code. It's a pretty unique book in that sense that it's quite a lot of thinking on about a single line of code. I'm not going to make you read the entire book, but I do want you to read the chapter on randomness, right, which talks about this one function in there, rand, the basic function, basic being the language for rand, creating random values. I want you to read that chapter and watch these videos before you complete the assignment for this batch of ideas. So this software studies lens is another kind of category or lens through which to look at the work and understand the work that we're going to be experimenting with and the way that we're going to be thinking about software and programming this quarter. Okay, so the plan for this set of videos, just to kind of intro what you're going to be diving into next. I've got a few videos. First, we're going to talk about what JavaScript is. What is JavaScript? Then I'm going to get into programming, learning programming. Now, some of us in the class are new to programming, some of us are not. I've made this video with all parties in mind. So we're going to be recreating this algorithm, this 10-print algorithm in JavaScript. And on the way to doing that, I'm going to be covering and explaining all of the foundations of programming. So this is going to be over the course of 2 videos. The first video is going to focus on variables and data types and operators in programming, but specifically in JavaScript. And then the following video is going to cover control flow, how we kind of control the flow of a program. And this is kind of 3 kind of fundamental concepts, which are conditional statements or if-else statements, loops, and functions. I'm going to be covering those both from an intro perspective and hopefully from a less intro perspective. So I'm both trying to introduce programming to those of you that have never done it before, but for those that have done programming, I'm going to be discussing these basics also from a kind of orientation perspective, just kind of comparing it to some of the other languages that you're maybe familiar with, just so those that are new to JavaScript but not necessarily new to programming can kind of get oriented in this JavaScript space. One of the other reasons I want to focus on this 10-print program, this kind of old school text-based Commodore 64 algorithm, is because I want to look at just this, in this first series, I want to just look at the language JavaScript in its purest sort of form before we take it into the browser. In the browser, we're going to have access to all these interesting creative APIs that I've kind of already alluded to a few times in previous videos. And it can be when you dive into things like that in the deep end, it can be hard to differentiate the code within the code that you're writing, what part of it is part of a library versus what part of it has to do with this browser API versus what's just JavaScript. So I want to first focus on just JavaScript, and then in the next set of videos we're going to dive into all these sort of creative APIs and libraries that we get by working in the context of the browser. So I'm going to cover what's JavaScript. I'm going to dive into all the basics. I'm going to try to do that in a way that hopefully is useful for both beginners and veterans. Then I'm going to talk about the assignment and specifically what I want you to do, which is essentially I want you to take this algorithm that we make in those two videos, this JavaScript implementation of the temprint algorithm, and I want you to remix it. But I have a whole video with different examples and approaches for how you might think about remixing this particular assignment or this algorithm. And then I've got a couple extra videos at the end. So way back at the beginning of the quarter, I mentioned that I'd be doing, sometimes having little tangents, sometimes having little deep dives. So after that assignment video, I'm going to do a kind of a deep dive for those. This is more aimed towards those that have experience with programming. I'm going to kind of show you some extra stuff in terms of how to write JavaScript in a few different ways, how JavaScript can be made a bit more efficient, and how you can express a lot of ideas with less code. That might be a little advanced for folks that are new to programming. Feel free to watch it regardless, but just saying that's a deep dive video. And then I also have like a little tangent, a little teaser video where we're going to recreate that, that's the same algorithm, but using a library called P5 and using a browser API called Canvas, just to kind of give you a little peek at where we're going to be going in the next set of videos this quarter. Okay, I think that's everything I need to say by way of introduction. Watch the videos, read the chapter on randomness, fork the assignment, and I look forward to checking out your remixes.